Hello and welcome to this Euractiv event supported by PKEE. A warm welcome to those in the room and the many, many more, of course, joining us online. Today we're going to be talking about financing the EU energy transition and European competitiveness and asking the overarching question, can the two coexist? Of course, a very timely conversation as we look into the new Commission mandate. Also, we noticed that the Mario Draghi report emphasised the transition within the competitiveness framework in his report last year. We also have questions around higher energy prices and affordable energy, as well as how to balance the investment into renewable energies and affordable energy supplies. So we're going to talk about that. We will look at it in the context of the EU's multi-annual financial framework and, of course, the Green Industrial Deal on the horizon. My name's Jennifer Baker. I will be your moderator today. We will then have an opening remarks from our speaker from Taiwan. We will then have a long panel discussion, but don't worry, you can ask questions during that discussion. We're going to be using the Slido tool to do that. For those of you here in the room, you can scan the QR code, which you can see around the room or on the screens. For you joining online, please just go to the box on your screen and I will receive those and we will try to get to as many of your questions as possible within the time we have. For now, I will hand over the floor to the opening remarks to Michael Orlowski, who is Vice President of Taiwan.
Hello. It's a pleasure to be here. I would like to start with short opening remarks before we get to the discussion. And I think the main topic of our meeting is a question. Can the financing of the EU transition and coexist with European competitiveness? We've all seen the Mario Draghi report, which undermines that EU is far from where it should be in terms of competitiveness. And we are also facing some post-Trump discussion around the energy transition, whether we should still continue the path or whether we should shift gears. I think from my point of view, this is not a real question, right? I think we have to continue the transition. The question is how to make it in the most optimal manner with the most efficient, in a most efficient way from the point of view of the costs, but also of the socially just transition approach. I think from my view, when we look at the challenges ahead, we are not only seeing that we need to still decarbonize the power mix, because already almost 70% of power in the EU is CO2 free, either renewable or nuclear. We still have the remaining 30%, but we also need to look at the broader picture. If we look at the overall energy mix in Europe, the share is far smaller. We are probably closer to 25% of renewable share in total energy consumption. This means that power is likely to replace other types of fuels in the coming years. We are likely to see a further electrification of the industry, but also demand growth for power coming from different sources, such as e-mobility, electrification of individual heating, and data centers, which are also on the rise in this area. Now, when we look at how to secure this energy, I think that we are in a different place that we were 15 or 20 years ago, because the economics of energy production has changed significantly. We started from a transition program, which was basically a subsidy scheme to a large extent, aimed at providing subsidy funding and additional cash flow for investments into renewables. We are now in a different place. The levelized cost of electricity production from wind and PV across the whole globe is already at the levels which are more competitive than new build conventional, and it's 60 to 70% lower than it used to be 15 years ago. So having a certain share of renewables is not only a political choice, it's also an economic benefit for the power system, which also enables to lower the prices for final customers. We see this happening at an even faster pace when we look at storage. If you look at storage 15 years ago, probably it used to be more than, we had a cost reduction of more than 90% in this period, indicating that now we are getting into an investable business case, just looking at the economics of shaving the peaks in power prices and selling the electricity from photovoltaics to final customers during evening periods. So having a share of renewables in the mix is important, but it's also important to have a capacity market which will enable to back up the renewables on the journey and provide electricity when it's needed, backed also by a grid which is resilient enough to sustain the new demand and connect the renewables. From my point of view, there are three key areas which we should consider when discussing how to fund the transition and how to make it work with the competitiveness. And the first issue for me is deregulation, which is especially linked in the energy production to efficient permitting. When we look at the way we permit projects now on the EU level, it's on average 4 to 6 years. But if I look at my most recent investment decisions on the wind side, those projects have more than 10 years of development behind them, right? If we look at more optimized geographies, you can get to even 2 years of development or go below that. So you have a more efficient time to market, first of all, but also then a more efficient technology, meaning you can utilize the latest technological developments, which are important, especially on the wind side. So and a deregulation scheme which would facilitate permitting is the first thing that we need from my perspective. Then secondly, I would get to return stability, and here I would differentiate a bit between technologies. I would start from grid. I know that there are some discussions whether we should facilitate intra-country frameworks for returns for those businesses. And I think building a system which would enable visibility and predictability of returns in the longer run would really help. We've had already a first release of that in Poland with a view on regulatory WACC for 3 years ahead. But having stability in there will enable us to get more funding and also make those cases more investable. Then we have the side of capacity, which is dispatchable. Here we need to discuss how to ensure that we have different types of sources in the system. When we look at the most recent Polish capacity market auction, it was won purely by storage players because storage has dropped in price so that it's now, I would say, fully investable. But it also meant that there is no conventional capacity going into the system. So for the periods where we would get a German Dunkelflaute, so no wind, no sun, there is no security ensured in the system, and those cases are not investable at the moment. And we need to jointly discuss how to tackle that. And then lastly, renewables. Historically, renewables needed subsidies. I think what they need now are de-risking schemes. By de-risking schemes, I mean schemes which will enable projects to be funded at the project level and which will enable dedicated debt to build those renewables. And those renewables, those issues can be tackled by either auctions, which can have even lower prices than the market expects, but provide an option to lower the risk of the projects, but also facilitation of PPAs, which are already a topic. And here the most important part is to cover for the credit risk of smaller enterprises, which might not be blue chips with high ratings at the moment. And then lastly, I would get to the financing side, meaning debt financing and subsidies. And my third topic is having clear and efficient rules there. And I think especially taxonomy might require some attention and discussion. We are a business with a small share of coal, which is residual. It's below 10% already of our business, but we are still penalized by financial institutions, and there are a lot of discussions how to interpret what can we finance, what can we not finance at the moment, and setting clear rules which would be inclusive for companies who are undergoing transition at the moment would be really beneficial. And ideally also subsidizing those parts of the market which might need subsidies. As I said, those are not renewables and probably not storage. If we are to follow further decarbonization path, if we are to go to hydrogen, biofuels, those are still areas which would need subsidies if we are to pursue them at the EU level. We have recently published a strategy as Tauron, and we are historically coming from the region which is the heart of coal mining in Poland. It is actually the region where still we have the largest company in the whole EU still mining hard coal. And even though we have the legacy of being consolidated by hard coal-based power generation, we have decided to still follow the transition regardless of the headwinds that we are already facing. So the vision of tomorrow that we have for the company is a company which will be phasing out coal. We have decided to phase out almost 80% of our fleet by 2030, and then try to divest the remaining part. invest heavily in grids, which are at the moment around 60% of our business, so that we create a backbone for increased consumption, but also production from renewable sources, which are fairly more distributed. And then we are investing heavily in renewables, while assuring that the green electricity flows to our final customers, and that we contract it directly, be it with individuals or larger customers, to ensure them electricity security, secondly price security, and thirdly green electricity, which they require to a broader extent every year. So this is our view on transition and the key challenges, but I think this is just an intro, and I would think we'll tackle the topic in debate in much more detail, so I'm really looking forward to the upcoming discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Michael, for your unique business perspective on the situation. We'll move now to our panel discussion, and I'm delighted to say we have a very varied panel joining us today. So let me welcome to the stage, please, Anna Colucci, who is Director for Energy and Environment in DG Competition, overseeing antitrust, state aid and merger instruments from DG Comp in the European Commission. Thank you very much, Anna, for joining us. Also from the EU institutions, we have Thomas Pellerin-Carlan, MEP, who is on the ITRE committee, which is very relevant for today, the Committee, of course, on Industry, Research and Energy. Next to him, we will have Manuel Barritor, who is the Principal Energy Economist at the European Investment Bank, who will be able to bring that unique perspective when we talk about investments. Jure Yada is Director of the EU Sustainable Finance Programme and Member State Strategy at E3G, which is an independent and non-partisan think tank, and her research covers private finance regulation, public finance and the politics of transition. So we look forward to hearing from you. And Michael, we will welcome you back onto the stage as well to join in this conversation. Anna, let me start with you. There's a lot of different points to raise when we talk about the energy transition, but you're coming from the competition side. So give me your perspective. Set out the scene for us in your view.
Okay. Thank you very much, and thank you for this, as you said, very timely discussion and conversation. Let me start maybe by just the recent news, and although I didn't want to name him, but Trump, as you know, has announced as soon as he came into office that he would take the US out of the Paris Agreement. And this started at the same time as Los Angeles was struggling with dramatic fires. So it just shows that the climate change is happening fast, as scientists are telling us, and that the energy transition is not optional, is actually essential. And Europe is not immune to those extreme situations. That's why the EU will not lower its ambition in the green transition. And if this was not challenging enough, we have a second challenge that you mentioned, which has become more acute since the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, and which concerns the the energy crisis, and which basically has made us aware that Europe's ambition to lead the global green transition must coexist with the need to remain competitive. And frankly, this is a very complex question. I'm sure we are going to advance in our conversation today, but we will not solve it. There is no silver bullet, because we have to answer quite many questions. So how to ensure that our transition will not weaken the competitiveness, how to ensure that energy-intensive industries responsible for 20% of Europe greenhouse gas emission and employing more than 8 million people remain at the center, at the focus of our attention. And this is why the Commission will present, this is announced for the 26th of February, a clean industrial deal that should reply to this dual challenge. It's I would like to say it's not a roadmap, it's a call for action to provide investors with predictability and stability, which has been your call, which they need very much, and delivering pragmatic solutions. Now, on the competition side, which is more my core business, Some of you might have seen that Ribera mission letters was emphasizing that competition should learn from the past, and especially from the temporary crisis and transition framework, to modernize the competition tools. Indeed, competition is a key tool to help in the transition, but also in the competitiveness of European industry, because it makes the industry and the industrial actor more efficient and prone to innovation. And from a state aid point of view, we have also shown that we can help the rollout of renewables even during crisis. So we will present also a framework at the same time as the announcement of the Clean Industrial Deal. But obviously competition is not the only tool, and we will need others as well. So this is the menu for the moment.
Well, I will come back to you with some questions on this state aid framework. Thomas, let me come to you, because I know you've spoken about this on many panels. Set out the scene from your perspective. Give us your view on what needs to happen and what's going to happen.
We are about to make very important decisions, and I think it's important before we make a big decision to zoom out and to understand where we're coming from. My short key message is that becoming clean is the only way for our industry to remain competitive. There is, for Europe, no other way. There would be other ways if we were sitting on tons and tons and tons of untapped oil and gas resources. But my home region, Normandy, is not Texas. And we can't drill, baby, drill just because of geology. And that geology is not something with which you can make a deal. So to understand, let me make 4 quick points about where we were 40 years ago, where most of our industrial competitiveness was built, and where we are today. First, China. 40 years ago, China was able to outcompete us on only one thing: super cheap labor. China had no technological leadership whatsoever. Today, by the admission of our own European car manufacturers, China is one technological generation ahead of us on cars, on batteries. And I'm not even mentioning solar PV, where they are way ahead of us. How did that happen? Well, they did their work themselves. They did a lot of very good job in order to build technological leadership. We did not. There are a few exceptions. We are decent on batteries. We're still extremely good on wind, especially offshore wind. But by and large, member states chose to underinvest in research and innovation. They prioritize short-term gains over long-term competitiveness, and we are currently paying the price of the austerity measures that were put in place in the late noughties and the early 2010s, where research and innovation budgets at the national level were slashed. Where can we go from there? Is abandoning our green objective the way to build clean competitiveness? Absolutely not. That would be shooting ourselves in the foot. Second point, 40 years ago, the USA was a stable ally that was providing to Europe security and was largely working in a way to create a largely rule-based trade order globally. Do I need to say the T word again? But obviously, we're no longer there. In short, Trump is a bully. Trump is bullying us. And the only way, and I know that from personal experience, and many in the room know that because we've been bullied, or at least some of us have been bullied in the past, in high school or otherwise. The only way to stop bullying is to stand up to the bully. And for that, we Europeans need to be together. We need to speak with one voice, von der Leyen or Kaja Kallas's voice, depending on the topic, but we need to speak with one voice there. Third point, 40 years ago, our industry could be competitive because it was relying on cheap fossil fuel. It was the moment of the Gorbachev era, and so the USSR was no longer seen as a threat. And if we go from the mid-80s to the mid-90s, places like recently liberated Poland or Slovakia, but also Western member states, were still relying on very cheap Russian gas. And in the mid-90s, it was Boris Yeltsin Russia. Clearly not a country that could threaten our security. Where are we now? We're in a situation where European leaders, or I must be precise, Western European leaders, have been blind for more than a decade on Russian illegal warfare in Georgia, in Crimea, in Donbass. And we finally woke up in 2022, but I still hear today some voices, especially coming from Central Western Europe, saying that we should do to Ukraine what Britain and my own country, France, did to Czechoslovakia in 1938 with the Munich Agreement, in order to have, again, access to cheap gas. So if we really believe in freedom, our freedom, we need to accept that we now live in a world where our gas supply, that still accounts for around a quarter of the energy we use, especially in the industrial sectors, is a gas that we need to pay, that we are paying 3 times more for than back in the day. 10 years, 20 years ago, the price of fossil gas in Europe was around 15 euros per megawatt hour. Now it's around 50. And it's not going to get better because 30, 40 years ago, most of the gas we were using in Europe, we were producing in Europe, in Great Britain, in the North Sea, and in the Netherlands. That is no longer the case. And now we're in a situation where gas prices are very high and will remain very high unless we betray Ukraine and therefore betray ourselves and our own sense of security and freedom. And those gas prices are now global gas prices because we rely on LNG. Today, half of the LNG we get is coming from the US. Trump knows that. He will use that at some point to bully us. Still today, 15% of the LNG we buy it from Vladimir Putin. Any ship that goes from Yamal in the north of Russia and lands and sells some gas in France, especially thanks to the, let's say, the good partnership between the French company Total and the Russian company Novatek, that money that we Europeans still give is funding Vladimir Putin's war on the European democracy and more specifically now on the freedom of the Ukrainian nation. And that LNG has a global price. And so whenever there will be a cold winter in China, we will see the increase of LNG prices and gas prices for the European industry. Whenever there is a drought in Brazil, we will see also an increase of the price of LNG in Europe. And to be clear, in a changed climate, a drought in Brazil is the new normal. The fourth and last point, 40 years ago, wind power was mostly something for science fiction, and maybe the Danes. 40 years ago, there was no functioning offshore wind turbine. That simply did not exist. The first one was installed in Denmark in the very early 90s. Solar panels did exist. They were invented in the 1950s, but they were used mostly to provide electricity for satellites in the space, not for us here, humans, living on planet Earth. Today, we know that those are cheap, they're clean, they're homegrown energy. They already provide a lot of electricity in Europe. The number one electricity source in Europe is nuclear, but the second one is wind. And the fifth one is solar. And now we have more electricity coming from solar than from coal, which is a historic shift when we know the key role that coal played in Europe over the last decades. And so to me, when we take those four things together, number one on China, we need to be great at clean tech. Because if we lose our clean tech leadership, then I'm sorry, but we already lost on tech. We already lost on tech. If we also lose on clean tech, then we'll just be a museum and no longer a continent that can play its role in the world. Second thing in the US, we need to be resilient to Trump the bully. That's why we need to phase out gas. It's less urgent for now to face US LNG than Russian LNG. Russian LNG is obviously the number one threat now, but we should not only undress Peter to pay Paul, rob Peter to play Paul, as they say in English. The third point, we have very expensive fossil gas, and this will stay for decades to come. And therefore, investing in renewable energy and energy efficiency is vital if we want to have an industry that can still be profitable in a world of very expensive fossil gas, just like Japan actually is doing. And fourth and last point, we have the solution. But that requires a better understanding, especially from some political parties in the European Parliament, that renewable energy and homegrown energy is the pillar on which we can base competitiveness. So I'm going to end on that, but to me, the kind of trade-off between green and competitive makes sense in Saudi Arabia and in the US. It does not make any sense for us Europeans. And we need to understand that and then act upon it.
Well, Thomas, I think you've encapsulated the whole geopolitical world there in those remarks. And I think you've really set out a very clear situation for us, and rather alarming one, if I may say. Manuel, as I say, Thomas has covered a lot of the sort of the realpolitik that we have to look at and the real world around us. But one thing he mentioned, of course, was lack of investment. Coming from the investment perspective, what has been happening, what needs to happen more?
Okay, thank you. I will be shorter in my presentation, if you allow me, focusing mainly on how the European Investment Bank is seeing this question. I think Europe, we stand at a pivotal moment for the EU energy transition. What we have been doing so far, and this was explained very well before, is that we have included and integrated renewables into existing system. Now, if you want to go further, you want to move forward, we really need to transform this electricity system to be able to integrate and reach our targets. This will require massive investment. We all know this 2% additional of GDP of additional investment needed. And this investment will have to take place before we can reap the benefits of lower marginal cost. I don't know about prices, but lower marginal cost of renewables. And so this is why financing this investment in the long term, in the longer run, is so important. And of course, as Thomas said before, this transformation must take place in a context of growing concern about security, energy security, economic security, and security at all. So what is very noticeable from an EIB perspective is that we have reaffirmed recently that our top priority, and this was done in the EIB Group Strategic Roadmap 2024-2027, our priority is to consolidate our role as the EU Climate Bank. So we are committed to support the European Green Deal. And in 2023, because we like figures, we've supported the energy sector with 21 billion euros for mainly renewables, energy efficiency, and grid. I invite you to follow the press conference of the EIB, which takes place in 2 days, where you will have figures for 2024, and I can already tell you that this lending to energy sector is increasing. Our focus areas in this field are twofold. The first one is competitiveness and productivity growth. I think this is the key focus of the discussion today. At the bank, we prioritize least cost, scalable solutions like energy efficiency, offshore wind, photovoltaics, and grid deployment. These are technologies that are proven, economically competitive, and ready for scale-up. So this explains the bulk of what we are financing. The second focus that we have is innovation. Innovation is needed to maintain the EU status as a clean tech powerhouse. It was very well explained. And over the last 5 years, EIB support to clean tech has reached 20 billion euros over 5 years. So it's significant. And this contributes to ensure technological autonomy, and we believe to boost our competitiveness as well. So just to conclude, the European Investment Bank will continue to focus on areas where investment needs are the greatest, where we can have, where we can be additional, and where we can make the highest impact. And to finish, I would just like to emphasize that for us, echoing what was said before, energy transformation is not just a necessity, it's also an opportunity to enhance economic security and competitiveness. Thank you.
Thank you. Joy, you've been studying the finance and the politics of this transition, so we'll get into a little bit more of the nitty-gritty on some of the proposals of the Commission in a bit. But give us the overarching view of you. I mean, is there a choice to be made between advancing the green transition on one hand and ensuring this competitiveness on the other? And is it a trade-off we can even afford to make?
I think when we look at the question of the energy transition, financing it, and also consider the question of European competitiveness, I do think that there is a suggestion that we're encountering not only in the debate here today, but also out in the political discourse, but also among some of the debates more in the public domain around the fact that these two may not be able to coexist. And I think we've heard from the previous panelists that this is not the case, but there's a lot of the current discussion which is around, well, actually, can we afford them at the same time, for example? Or how can we consider some of the political signals as we look to really moving from setting out the European Green Deal under the previous Commission and now having the hard task of implementing that in a highly volatile geopolitical environment. And I think when we look at some of these debates, and if there are some of you who are following the conversations in Davos, we heard a lot of this then, which is around, well, actually, maybe the climate agenda is harming potentially Europe's economic growth. Or maybe perhaps that there are rules in the EU regulatory framework that are making us not competitive vis-a-vis what we will see be the deregulation playground in a way under the second Trump administration. And maybe we need to slow things down and actually have a good think about what the green transition and the competitiveness mean side by side. And while I think none of us here will actually deny the fact that it is a complex transition and that some of the costs and the implications are not felt equally or evenly across different parts of Europe, much less different parts of society, I think this does miss the point, and I think it's something, Thomas, you mentioned earlier, which is this actually does not recognize the nature of what it would mean for Europe to be competitive in the future, and that is actually to have a system and an economy that's based on resiliency to shocks, on a decarbonized and sustainable system and economy, and also affordable, accessible, secure energy based on renewables, but also based on, of course, smart grids and efficiency. So this is what it is, what is in it for us. This is what sustainability would look like as we look to compete in the economy of tomorrow. And this is, I think, what sometimes gets missed in the debate when we get set up to, in a way, to try to compete these two goals and to pit them against one another. And I would actually say that in Europe, because of the work done under the previous mandate, but also the early climate leadership, we are reaping benefits from this already. So the IEA found that in 2023, 30% of European GDP came from clean energy. So that's huge, and I think this is what we need to keep in sight to maintain some of the political commitments, but also to create the confidence for businesses, for investors, that despite some of the relook we're having at the regulatory framework, among other things, that the overall direction is not going to change. And I think that is what it would take to actually deliver a lot of the private investments, and I'm sure we'll talk about this shortly, into the transition. But this is not really what we're seeing at the moment. So if I were to come to a second point, the nature and the conversation around what the EU has as its advantage in the competitiveness race, shall we say, is actually we're being compared, and we're seeing solutions being put forth that may work in other jurisdictions, that may work in the US, for example, and we talked about deregulation earlier and what Trump may put in place. But that's actually not, if we do the same, that's not playing to Europe's strengths. And this may not be a very popular view at the moment, but one of Europe's strengths is regulation, its stability, its standards. It's our ability to harness our internal markets, to drive financing for innovation, to drive financing for these investments into green, while also developing international norms and standards. And I think if we take some of the conversations that are in the debate right now around simplification, but also taking them maybe even further into deregulation, we may actually be missing some of the strengths that investors outside the US are even looking for in the EU, which is predictability, which is legal certainty, and it's also not being in the way of some of the anti-ESG backlash and litigation that they're seeing in the US when they're trying to invest in their own green transition. So I think that's a strength we need to look at, and we need to recognize where we need to differentiate some of the solutions and the measures towards competitiveness and what it means to be a competitive economy in the EU. And the last element I'll touch on is, well, is this all affordable at the same time? Are there trade-offs? Is there even enough money right now, particularly in public finances, to support both the green transition objectives, but also other political objectives like security, defense, and so on? I would argue these two are also intertwined, much like competitiveness is. But I would say that, yes, I do feel that there is enough money. It's a matter of political courage and will at the moment, which is quite challenging given some of the different political dynamics we're seeing among different member states, but also in Europe and more broadly in the world. And somebody mentioned, I think, fossil fuels and fossil fuel subsidies. Even reallocating fossil fuel subsidies to other costs, to other investments that can support the green transition will free up 3/4 of the investments we need, according to one estimates, to reach decarbonization in the EU by 2050. So I think it's about putting some of the nuance, and we may not be in an age of nuance right now, but actually looking at some of these different strengths that the EU has and not falling into the rules of a game set across the Atlantic, which is talking about deregulation, making it seem like they're easy political choices when in fact they're not.
Well, I don't ever suggest that there are easy choices to be made, but I think we can probably agree that the implementation of the EU's climate goals is pretty imperative. You know, we see these horrific wildfires and we see once in a lifetime or once in a generation storms happening in my home country just last week. So I feel that that's maybe a given on this panel. We can drop the debate on that. But Michael, you know, to implement these climate goals, as we've heard indeed from Manuel, you know, we need appropriate financing if we want to keep the competitive side as well. So what does that look like from the perspective of a company like Tauron?
Yeah. So maybe before I jump to financing, I will tell you a bit more about our business, and because this creates the whole frame for what we are talking about. And we are actually, AIB is one of our financing institutions, a major one from our point of view. So we are already collaborating in this space. So when you look at our business, this is basically the largest segment is distribution. We are providing electricity via our grids to around 6 million customers with around 50 terawatt hours of distributed energy. And we also have a sales segment, which is also around 6 million customers, around 30 terawatt hours of sales to final customers. And then we have different types of generation, which is basically fossil-based, coal fleet right now at around 4 gigawatts. Then we have around 800 megawatts, or probably 900 already in renewables. And growing fast. And then we have district heating, which is a bit of specific of certain countries which are farther to the north of Europe, might not be applicable for all the countries in this space. What we indicated in our strategy is that we will invest around, in total we want to spend in the next years around 100 billion PLN, so let's call it 23 billion euro in the years to come. And 60% of this will go towards distribution. And for us, distribution is really important because it's the backbone of transition. Without grids, you cannot really deploy new renewables at scale. But also the system has really changed, right? So as Thomas rightfully indicated, we were going from a really centralized system with large power plants, producing electricity and distributing through all the voltages down to final customers. Right now, the picture is far more complex. We have we can cover almost peak capacity of the system only with PV, which is mostly rooftop at the moment. So it's basically about many producers placed all around the grid. And we really need a grid which can be fully flexible to be able to transfer electricity from where it's produced to where it's needed, and it requires a complete makeover on the way that those grids used to operate. Then, secondly, we have renewables, and here we are aiming to invest around 30 billion PLN, 7.6 billion euro into renewables, and our answer is to provide what our customers needs. So our customers more often have their own rooftop PV. So they don't really need electricity from photovoltaics anymore. There is a certain share which we can still add to the mix, probably 10 to 15%, but they mostly need wind if they are to be decarbonized. That's why our answer is mostly onshore wind, because it's the profile that the final customers need. And at the same point in time, it has fairly less regulatory and inflation headwinds than offshore wind does in our country. So it's a more of a pragmatic approach to tackle the topic. And then this is another 30% of our capex, and then we have, I would say, conventionals and transformation of heating with the remaining share. And to fund those, I mean, the topics vary a bit by technology. So for distribution, I think utilizing public funding is actually really efficient. We've recently obtained a large loan from National Recovery Plan operated by our local development bank, with a fixed fee of 0.5%, so really cheap money. And distribution has the beauty of being a natural monopoly. So the more subsidies we get, it's not a competitive process, right? But it lowers the cost for final customers directly, and it lowers the bills across the whole grid, right? So getting public funding in there is from our point of view, really efficient, and we did get that. But it's also a really pleasant business to finance for the financing institutions, as long as the regulatory framework and returns are considered stable, right? So here, I mean, different banks, they basically provide the whole financing for our group due to the fact that we have distribution in place. And that it's existing. Then when we look at renewables, for us, we are still mostly financing using also cross-financing from distribution, but we are using also to a broader extent and implementing some project financing options. And here selling the electricity farther on to final customers or participating in auctions is key. In this segment, there used to be some subsidies, but they are unlikely to still be in place because it's become quite an investable case as long as you can have a reasonable risk profile, which is usually related to offtake. And here we are using different types of banks. Then we have storage systems, which for us still have some subsidies in place, which is great. There is a subsidy scheme in Poland for 1 billion euro, which is happening right now. But those assets are hard to finance by banks, actually, due to the risk profile. So for us, as a big corporate, it's possible to still finance them basically with cross-funding and taking some risks on our balance sheet. But for smaller players, it's a more difficult topic because the risk of storage is mostly about short-term volatility of pricing. So it's really hard to fund in a conventional way in the current system. And then the remainder, I think for us it's important that we have a legacy share of coal in the business, which is around 5 to 10% at the moment. But it stops a lot of financial institutions from lending us money at all, right? And these are mostly commercial banks that are in there. But there is quite some controversy also around taxonomy, how to interpret it, what can be funded, what cannot be funded in the current scheme. So I think having a certain here openness and a certain approach to taxonomy, which could enable us to basically still be funded from a broader pool of commercial banks, would really help. Because business-wise, we don't really need any cash for coal, which we would source externally. But still, we are highly penalized, and most of the financial institutions we had, which were backing us, already have some limits or have stopped financing us at all due to the legacy share in the business. So solving this, I think, would help for many institutions. So overall, when we look at how we want to finance, I would say it's still mostly commercial loans, including EIB, but we are looking to get a significant share of 20 to 30% of either subsidies or preferential loans in the mix. And I think with the share of distribution that we have, this should be possible. And this funding will really enable us to increase the scale of investment and make the transition happen within Poland. Without it, we would not be able to achieve those targets.
Well, thank you. I mean, I look forward to hearing if any of the other panelists have ideas regarding financing for legacy non-renewables. But Anna, I'm going to come back to you because I see we've got almost a dozen questions in from the audience already. So I'll try and bring them together with I did promise to already ask you about the new state aid framework. So in fact, Carlos Emanuele from Euroheat and Power is asking about that. And he's asking, will it be published in late February? And will it ensure that heat projects are included as well? Heat projects. Yeah. Okay. So tell us a bit more broadly about that, but also if you can answer Emmanuel's specific question, that would be great.
Okay. So I think what is clear from the conversation we just heard is that we need not only to do both, but to do it faster and more ambitiously. And this is mainly due to the fact that not only this is a geopolitical imperative, but also to the bare situation that we don't have those fossil fuel raw materials and energy, and that we are depending from the others. So if we want to decrease the energy prices, we need to roll out more renewables and even low carbon energy. So that's the diagnosis. How competition policy can help in doing that? We have different instruments. One of them, we hear it very often, is to allow for state aid. And so this is the state aid control that is in our competence. The Draghi report has showed to us that the amount of investment that are needed are so huge. And part of it will come from the private sector, but still there is a residual part that will have to come from governments, from member states. We know that their fiscal space is becoming more and more tight. So we need to be efficient in allowing that. So from a state aid control point of view, we have the experience of the temporary and crisis framework, which has showed that we can allow the rollout of renewables in a very quick manner. And actually, during the last 3 years, we have taken decision that allowed for member states to spend more than 4 billion euros in terms of state aid, so in just 3 years. Also to help in the to incentivize the industrial decarbonization and to have sufficient manufacturing capacity of strategic clean tech, something that we heard several times. And so all this experience that we have gained since 2022 is something that we will use for our new framework. We have in the beginning of January launched a survey towards member states in order to get their feedback, and the idea is then to announce this framework and the details of it on the 26th of February at the same time of the Clean Industrial Deal. So at this stage, I can only say that the experience that we have had so far will be the big basis for it. But obviously, we are looking also at ways to go further and to simplify further, since simplification is an important element of this conversation. And to come back to what has been said before, simplification doesn't mean deregulation. I think this distinction is very important because, indeed, we should not surrender those elements of our legislation that are extremely important, and even say that that legislation has been adopted recently, so it needs to be enforced. We cannot run, all the time to new elements. We need to also make sure that what we have adopted is enforced. But we have to be aware that simplification is an important element, and that will help quite significantly the industry. So we are listening to that, and this will be also an important element in our framework.
Thank you, Anna. You've covered a lot there. There is a lot to unpack, and as I said, the questions are coming in extremely fast for everyone. So I'll touch on a few and then give each of you a chance to respond to a lot of what is already being said in one go. So Marc Defresne is raising the point that no one has mentioned nuclear, which is perhaps worth bringing into the conversation. And Mpandle wants to know how EU legislation can be improved to provide a clear, long-term and sustainable framework, as also keeping in mind the different challenges towards policy of competitiveness, including higher energy costs, investment burden and manpower capacities. I think stuff that we've already touched on a little bit. We're also having questions regarding how can member states allocate state aid, but I think, Annie, you've touched on that, and how can public and private entities collaborate effectively. And more comments and questions coming in. Anton Mifsud Bonici very much appreciated your intervention, Thomas, and was asking whether lower barriers to the import of renewable energy derivatives would give the time for the homegrown market to actually develop its internal renewable market. As I say, a lot of different moving parts there, a lot to unpack. Thomas, I'll let you, because I see you scribbling away, take your time to try and maybe unpick a few of those, as I can see as well the other panelists have a lot to add.
Yeah, I'll just talk about the quantity and the quality of the public investment that we need. In one of my last research job was actually a year ago, trying to estimate the climate investment deficit in Europe. So to compare the amount of investment that is actually happening in the real economy in terms of battery electric cars, energy efficiency improvements in buildings, offshore wind rollout, etc., and what we would need. And if you want to, at the end of the day, when we crushed the numbers, we really came out to a glass half empty, half full. Because I don't remember whether so on the top of my head, what we saw in 2022 were 407 billion euros of public and private investment in 23 key sectors. And the gap was 406 billion euro. So yeah. But if we put aside the detailed number, the order of magnitude was mentioned by the IB before, that's 2% of the GDP. And so whenever we say that those are huge amounts of investment, I mean, yes and no. Yes and no. Like 2% is significant, but it is only 2%. If we just look, and by the way, those are public and private investment. If we look in other sectors, were we able in the recent past to do a budgetary effort of increasing some spending by 2%? Yes. Look at what Poland did on defense. In 2022, that is the moment where Vladimir Putin sent his battle tanks to be destroyed by the Ukrainian military in the north of Kyiv. That year, Poland invested 2.4% of its GDP in defense. This is only public funding. And 2.4% was already higher than the 2% target and much higher than what other countries that have been less serious on security, like Germany or France, did. And Poland, in only 3 years, is bringing this from 2.4 to 4.7%. That's a doubling of the investment. That's an increase of 2.3%. Why? Because the Polish elite and the Polish nation have understood that there is a clear threat, that Vladimir Putin, if he were ever to win in Ukraine, will attack either Poland or neighbor next. And therefore, against that threat, the Polish nation and the Polish government and the Polish parliament decided to find more than 2% of the GDP, which to me proves that this is entirely feasible if there is the political will to do so. Okay? So that's for the quantity of funding. Then if we go a little bit more into the quality, and I'm speaking on defense spending as someone who served in the French military for 6 years. So I'm all in favor of increasing defense spending when the needs is there and the needs there is a need now. But those spending are not profitable. The Leopard 2 battle tank that we're going to have in 2042 is not going to produce anything. While the wind power, the wind turbine or the solar panel that we install today will be producing something that will be useful for the economy. I mean, defense policy, defense spending is an insurance policy. You need to invest in it because you're happy that you have it whenever the shit hits the fan, if you allow me to be a little bit Trumpian in my remark for that sentence. But virtually all the climate investment that we need is actually stuff that is profitable, that will increase the prosperity of the European economy. So the quality of the funding, this investment is qualitative in the sense that it will generate growth, and that is long-term sustainable growth of our economy in the future. What can the public sector do? I would love for my political family, the Social Democrats, to be in power everywhere in Europe and to have a simple majority in the European Parliament, and then we could pass an investment plan in order to rise up to history. But obviously that's not the case. So if we leave aside the quantity of the funding, what is the quality of the public support that we can have? It's all about predictability. And what we need are instruments that target specific sectors, because what companies need is not climate investment in general, but specific investment in, for instance, the deep renovation of tertiary buildings or in battery manufacturing in Europe, in those specific sectors where companies are active. And what we need to deliver is a 10-year horizon on the type of public funding that those companies would get. It is what the Inflation Reduction Act delivered in the US. It is what the JX program delivers in Japan. It is what the 5-year plan delivers in China. In Europe, we do not have it. Or rather, we only have 2 very small exceptions at the EU level. Those are the Hydrogen Bank and the new battery manufacturing support scheme that the Commission and the EIB are being rolled out in December. And to me, I'm supporting those 2 elements as prototypes that later need to be scaled up in order to deliver what Europe needs, which is a clean tech investment plan. When we have one single European auction system, and where everybody that applies to that, every company applies to that EU level auction system, and the best of the best get the limited EU money that we have, but obviously the more EU money, the better. And those that are very good, but just fall below the threshold because we don't have enough European funding, then get national funding, and DG Comp will automatically give the state aid approval on that because those schemes, those projects have been already pre-selected as part of a pan-European scheme, and therefore funding them does not create a problem of distortion of competition.
I want to get Manuel's view on this because we're talking about a lot of areas that will certainly be of interest to you. And I write a lot about insurance, and I would say that many actuaries would argue that any investment in climate mitigation is an insurance. So,
Awesome.
Manuel.
Yeah. So from our perspective, I think a lot has been said already. I just want to clarify that we will not be able to finance this transition without private capital. That's very clear. And so this is what we do at the bank. We never finance 100% of a project. We always co-finance, financing a part. And the objective that we have is to catalyze private investment. That's true in all what we do. One key word here, which was not yet pronounced, I think, is de-risking. Of course, de-risking for private investor is key to be able to finance this. We can finance smaller operators. We do not only finance large corporates. We do project finance. We have been able to finance last year project finance operations for renewables in Spain, in Portugal, in Italy. So this is happening. There are ongoing discussions to further de-risk corporate PPAs with smaller companies. Together with the Commission, so we are discussing a way to a product to protect against the payment default by off-takers. So this is ongoing. It's maybe not massive, but this will definitely help this segment to attract private investment. This partnership and attracting private investment is also important for innovation. We have a partnership with Energy Breakthrough Innovation and the Commission. We have been able to finance a company to scale up its innovative technologies. For instance, just to mention it, Energy Dome in Italy last year was a very nice example of what we can do in this area in partnership with private capital. So all this is absolutely needed in the longer run to ensure competitiveness. I would also like to mention one point regarding how we can create this stable regulatory framework. Last week we had a workshop at the bank on clean tech, and of course, usually when you invite clients, they ask money. But so I asked them, what is the single most important investment barrier that you are facing in your activity? And the clear answer was demand. So what is very important is to have stability of and predictability of demand for clean products made in EU. So that's a very clear answer that we received. One last point, because I'm not sure I will have a chance to take the floor another time, on electricity grids. So you mentioned that indeed we are financing Torrent. I've personally been involved in several operations with you. So last year, our financing to electricity grid doubled. So this shows the market trend, the demand. We are demand-driven at the bank. So investment in grids is increasing massively, not only in distribution, but also transmission. Transmission is very important. We have financed last year, approved the financing of interconnection between Spain and France through the Bay of Biscay, a big project, very expensive, but very much needed to have access to these cheap renewables. We know all the difficulties of doing this. We also know that transmission and grids are capital intensive. So when it comes to competitiveness, we also need to be mindful of the impact of these massive investments on electricity bills, of course. I will stop here.
Well, thank you. I think you've answered another question that we've had coming in. Akira Sato was asking, is investment of the 750 to 800 billion, as advocated in the Draghi report, realistic during the struggling financial situation in certain European countries? So I think you've addressed a bit of that. Juraj, give me your thoughts. We've made a lot of comments so far, but your reactions, please.
I think picking up on how you were saying around the taxonomy, and I think coming back to some of the points raised on the regulatory framework. So I work a lot on financial regulation, looking at how to mobilize private and investment through those levers. And I think those of us who are familiar with that framework, a lot has been done quite quickly in the last mandate. And it went from trying to establish what constitutes a green economic activity, so the taxonomy, to getting more information around what businesses are doing for sustainable transition, but also what investors are doing. So those are the disclosures. And then also looking at the question of how to fill those information gaps. And I think I bring this up now because when we talk about simplification, about making sure that there isn't undue burden on businesses and investors as they look to try to make those investments, try to change the business models, really progress into this transition to a low carbon economy where they can be competitive. I think to Anna's point, we need to recognize that some of these tools have yet to be implemented and to work. So taxonomy, it's one question I think you're raising is around what's in it and what's not. Do we need additional clarification? And here there's the question of transition finance, which is not finance for things considered already sustainable or green, but for activities that can help people transition into that green category. And that's not right now outlined per se to much extent in the current version of the taxonomy. Will there be space to add to that? I think in the current environment, and especially in the current discussions on regulation, probably not quite in the shape that some are calling for. But again, there are also tools like transition plans, and this might sound very granular, but I'm just giving an example of ways that investors and others are looking to engage in the businesses they invest in, which is to see, does this business have a plan of putting investments to reach a certain target that is both aligned with the climate objectives, but also can show credibly how these different investments will help the business reach decarbonization, sustainability. And that is very much part of the framework that is being discussed right now through simplification, potentially under the omnibus that I think many of us have heard about. So I think it's to say that there are tools, we're waiting for them to yield results. Of course, making them efficient, providing the right support and guidance to get them to perform the way they need to is absolutely critical. But I think to get back to the point of let's maybe not shake things up too much to the point where they create confusion rather than provide solutions and the tools that they were intended to, I think that would be quite something to take into consideration as we look to going beyond green finance and into transition finance as well.
Thank you. Michael, I'm going to come to you and ask you to unpack a lot of this as well. But in the meantime, I do want to acknowledge some questions that have come in that you might want to address as well. Pierre Deschamps is saying shorter permitting times is essential, but what can we do? Because this is often not at EU level, but it's at national level or below. Laurent Zibel is asking how the costs of long-term interseasonal energy storage for winter calm weather compared to short-term storage. And Michael, I was going to ask you as well, because I know Torrens' new strategy is very much about heating. How do you plan to make that work, and how do you plan to keep that affordable and stable for consumers? Because we haven't really spoken so much about them to a great degree.
Yeah, look, so a lot of questions which I could probably address for hours, but I'll try to be brief as brief as possible, right? So maybe getting to the first topic of permitting, I think there is a large part at the national level, and there are some frames which are already existing at the EU level. But I think, so we have RED III kind of permitting procedures, impact. Then we have renewable energy zones, which are also on a regulatory level a certain proposal. But I think they are still not fully understood or tackled in the same way across Europe. And I think especially on the renewable energy zones, getting some farther into the regulation and discussion, how we could actually make it work in the EU context of dense population and lack of large deserts, as they do have in Australia, for example, where they basically look at grid and say, okay, here we'll build this much renewables. We need to find a way on how to translate those into faster permitting procedures for the countries. But I acknowledge that there is a large part of the work which is done to be done at the country level. Then looking at long-term storage versus short-term storage, I would say that we've seen a significant capex drop for short-term storage in the last years. I would say over the last 18 months, it's probably somewhere around between 50 and 72% in the offers that I receive for capex on lithium-ion batteries. So really going down, especially driven by Chinese producers, of course, at the moment. while longer-term energy storage still probably is more expensive at the moment, but there are a couple of emerging technologies. I would say a bit longer duration is our project of pumped hydro, which we are working on at the moment. It's a large one from our point of view, around 1.2 billion euro capex for a single location. But it's a technology which could work, but it's not really fully scalable. There are only certain places in Europe you need really natural conditions which could make it work. So this is an answer which we are trying to address. And there are a couple of technologies who I would call which are a bit earlier in the development process, be it compressed air storage, underground hydro power plants, and different technologies. But I would say when you look at those, they are still not close for us to being investable at the moment. The short-term storage is the part which is already, I would say, commercial when you look at the most recent auctions. And then getting to a heating segment. Actually, I mean, for most of the countries, you might not even know how district heating works, but for certain countries in Europe, it's the backbone of how we heat homes in larger cities. And we do have second largest system in Poland with around 800,000 households heated from our grid. So it's a problem which concerns a large part of our population. And here the solutions are even more complex than we see for the power sector, actually, which might not be fully obvious to everyone. Right now, the vast majority of heating is done via coal-based sources, and this is the legacy source of heat for those systems. It's done in a more efficient way than pure power production because the combined efficiency of the process is much higher. So basically, if you look at power plants, probably the median efficiency is around 40% on coal. If you look at cogeneration, so producing the two, it's probably twice that much. So you are consuming 2 times less coal for the units of energy which you are getting, but still it's coal, right? There is less CO2, but still there is quite some CO2 involved in the process. And decarbonizing this segment is actually quite a challenge, right? The easiest solution is gas that you could have, but at the same point in time, there are certain technologies which are already hydrogen ready, but it's not fully widespread to be able to have an investment which is bankable, I would say, that the first point, and secondly, provides a decarbonization path in the longer run. And EU has set a certain framework which indicates a 35% target of renewables in the heating grid by 2035. And the current go-to technologies in Polish conditions are firstly renewable electricity. It works really well, especially during summertime, where you basically just heat up the water from the district heating system. And then you can use cheap PV if you use heat accumulation, and this is what we are doing in every system. But it's only probably around 10 to 15% of total heat production. And for the farther part, probably, I mean, there are two choices. You either go for gas, which is switched to hydrogen or biogas at a certain stage, but it's a bit challenging now, and it's a big question whether hydrogen will make the cut to be economic in 2035. I highly doubt it with the current developments on hydrogen. Or you go for biomass. But biomass also is a bit of a complex topic because we have different industries competing for it. Paper, furniture industry, which in our country and in most of the countries which have a lot of biomass are actually also present and competing for the same amount. So it's quite a debate in Poland on how to tackle that. I think the good part is that there are already some subsidies in place for this part of the business. It's important because those are also natural monopolies. So every euro you put into subsidies, the lower the bill for final customers directly without any discussion. It's a fully tariff-based business due to the fact of being a natural monopoly. So there is quite some space for the subsidies, and we hope that they can continue. But the question on how to decarbonize heating at scale and how to make it renewable is still not solved. And I would say we are farther away than the electricity sector itself as a core due to the competition between different industries for the same feedstock, basically, at the moment.
Well, I'll throw this one open to all the panel because I see we're running short of time, but several people have raised the question of nuclear and whether that should be a complement to, to create a fully decarbonised situation. They're citing, not one, but several people citing intermittency and the high cost of renewables as a reason to consider that in the mix. Who would like to tackle where and how nuclear should be brought in? Anna.
From the Commission point of view, we are, cold bureaucrats, and we look at what the treaty tells us. And the treaty basically says that member states are completely sovereign on the mix that they will choose. So for us, as long as it is low carbon, we will not make a judgment call concerning nuclear. As far as competition policy is concerned, we look at those cases, and we have actually taken an important decision in April of last year concerning the development of a nuclear power plant in the Czech Republic, the Dukovany project, where we have set what are the high principles to provide state aid to this kind of technology, because it's a technology that still require quite a substantial public subsidies, because it's quite risky, it's quite important in terms of magnitude, and it's a very long-term project to develop. So this is the very cold and neutral reply you will get from my side. But it's clear that a lot of member states, and more increasingly, and we see it from the competition point of view, are developing that technology, especially those ones that are limited in terms of renewable rollout, that have not too many natural resources, and that would like to decrease their dependencies. So this is one avenue that they are looking at.
That's the diplomatic response. Thank you, Anna. As a Frenchman, Thomas, briefly, do you have any thoughts?
I mean, it depends on the person asking the question, whether you talk about the legacy nuclear fleet or whether you talk about new nuclear reactors. What matters now is really the legacy nuclear fleet. And I did speak about nuclear earlier, reminding all of us that I think it's about a third of the electricity that is produced in Europe is coming from nuclear. Nuclear is the first electricity generation capacity that we have today. And obviously, it makes a lot of sense to use those legacy nuclear power plants for as long as nuclear safety engineers tell us that we can do that. And it's not for politicians to step in, because unless one is both a politician and a nuclear safety engineer, and I know of zero MEP who has both capacity, it's really up to them to tell us whether the plan can be used in a secure manner, whether there is investment that needs to be made, or whether the plan needs to be shut down. From that perspective, when you have a national sovereign decision to shut down functioning nuclear reactors, obviously that leads to higher electricity prices in Europe, all of the things remaining equal. But here again, as it was said, that is a national prerogative. When we talk about new nuclear power plants, the economics there, it's too soon to tell. It is a bet, and sometimes bets are worth taking, but we do not know yet what would be the cost of building up 6, 12, or 20 new nuclear power plants. What we see for now is that different countries are choosing different technologies, which is not great from an economies of scale perspective. And it fails to me, I fail to understand how choosing an Asian tech for nuclear, or even an American one, makes sense from an energy security perspective. But still, that is the choice, the sovereign choice that was made by a few nations. Whatever happens for new nuclear, this will have zero impact on our energy prices for the next 12 years. So we need to put nuclear at the right place. Legacy nuclear is critical. New nuclear, still unknown.
Yes, Manuel.
Yes. So my answer on nuclear will be a more generic one. I think when it comes to nuclear, but when it comes to other clean technologies as well, if Europe really wants to become and stay competitive, this is about innovation. So we need also to innovate in all technologies, including nuclear. Small modular reactors are progressing rapidly in some geographies. We used to have a leadership in Europe. If we want to keep it, we need to continue investing in research and innovation, including in nuclear. Just to quote a figure, we did a study with the European Patent Office last year, and Europe had 27% of the clean tech patents, if you want, globally, in front of other geographies. So if you want to remain this clean tech powerhouse, we need massively to continue investing in research and development, including nuclear.
Okay, so Jura and Mikhail, I'm going to leave it to you to wrap up. I'm going to give you a minute each to answer the question I asked at the beginning, which was the EU energy transition and European competitiveness. Can the two coexist? It's a yes-no question, but it's also a yes and no answer. Jura, go ahead.
I think there's so much that's been said already, and I'll keep it short. I think yes. There's a lot that we did and did not touch on, including the upcoming pieces such as the Affordable Energy Action Plan, looking at, of course, I think with a lot of curiosity, what's going to come in the clean industrial deal. So I think it's about balancing that political direction, giving certainty on the regulatory framework, but also encouraging that private investment to come in and showcasing that this is the right place to make those investments and to really deliver on the potential that we have to become this competitive, sustainable economy of the future. So I think there's a lot to be gained and a lot to be decided on this year. We didn't talk too much in depth about the MFF, but that's the proposals and the negotiations are going to be coming up later in the year. So a lot of pieces, a lot of opportunity, but I think a lot of very difficult debates to come.
Mikhail, the poison chalice of the final word goes to you.
No, I think I had the opening word and I have the final word. I don't think it's fair for the other participants, but then I'll keep it really short. So I think, as I stated at the beginning, and I think I haven't changed my mind during the debate, it's not a question yes or no. I think they have to, right? And I fully agree with Thomas that there is no other choice than to build competitive advantage in the field where we differ, right? And we will not be sitting on hydrocarbons. We also have a really dense population. We have social acceptance issues, and we will not change that, right? So let's try to get out of this the best we can. And this means, for me, creating optimal conditions for fast decarbonization in the best way possible, in building the potentially best wind turbines based on the best permitting options, and then having also financing which lowers the overall cost of the investment for the economy, right? So that's it.
Thank you all very much. Thank you very much for all of your great insights. I'm sorry we couldn't cover everything in the short amount of time we had. Thank you so much to you, our audience, for your many, many questions. We did get to as many as we could, but hopefully you will stay tuned with us here at Euractiv for more debates, which I'm sure we will be covering this topic again in the weeks and months to come. You can find out more about those debates by going to events.euractiv.com. And a very warm welcome and thank you to you in the room. Please enjoy your afternoon. Have a great day.